So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2018 Darwin College Lectures. As you know, the theme of this year's series is migration. Now, I'm a geophysicist. To me, migration means relocation of a seismic signal in order to identify the subsurface structure from which it originated, deep beneath the Earth's surface. That way you can get a 3D image insight into the original structures. Basically, hospital scans use similar techniques. And it's also part of the way in which you can read, say, a closed, rolled Dead Sea Scroll, or perhaps an ancient carbonized Greek play. Migration is building the insight. But then you think about migration assistant. Of course, that's a computer application. It helps you move from one laptop to another. It's very useful. So migrants, well, we're almost all migrants or descended from migrants. Some centuries ago, others much more recently. This is Cambridge, of course. We send migrants out. Think about John Harvard. 3 signatories of the American Declaration of Independence. We welcome people in. Darwin College's much-loved fellow, Cesar Milstein, and all the new drugs that his work has led to. Many Nobel Prize winners. Further back, we think about Olada Equiano, not just a freed African slave and a great writer, but also Cambridge's early Arctic scientist. Then there are national leaders, kings, George I, William I, III, or Queen Charlotte, who perhaps had African ancestry. Then Prime Minister, if you think about Bonar Law from Canada, or music, Handel. Go further back yet, nightmare times, the barbarians at the door, the Visigoths who sacked Rome, Attila and the Huns, the Vikings who raided Iona and Lindisfarne. Further ago again, Theodore of Tarsus and Adrian the African together helped light the lamp of knowledge in Anglo-Saxon England. Before all those, the ancient migrants who sought safety in Africa, Abraham's starving clan, or Joseph and Mary and Jesus, all desperately seeking asylum. And much, much earlier than all of this, maybe some 120,000 years ago, modern humans started to migrate out of Africa. So the African San could thus be the only indigenous people on Earth. Now, our speaker tonight is David Olusoga. Many of us will be familiar with his books and his television programs. Perhaps you were watching BBC Two last evening. But like the seismic records that are migrated to obtain detailed 3D images of deep within the Earth, he's able to weave fascinating pictures from fragmentary records to help us see and understand back into the past. So please welcome David Olusoga, who's going to speak tonight on Black and British migration. David.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mic's working. Can you all hear me? First thing to check always. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. A couple of words of warning. I was in Los Angeles about 20 hours ago, so I have no idea what time my body thinks it is. I'm also recovering from pneumonia, and so my voice might not sound like this in half an hour's time. So to warn you in advance of the physical impediments. Also, as was said, I work in television. I write popular history books. I'm not an academic, so my lecturing style might differ somewhat from what you're used to. If you could bear with me, I'll try to rein myself in, control my more theatrical impulses as best I can, but I am a creature of those mediums. I'd like to talk tonight not just about Black British migration, but about what we're going through in this country in relation to thinking about that history, the place that history has in popular debates of the moment. And I'd like to begin by asking you to think back to an event that took place just 6 years ago, an event that in retrospect I've come increasingly to see as the high watermark, perhaps symbolically, more than anything else, of a phase in Britain's attitudes towards migration, integration, race, identity, and Britishness. And that event was the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympic Games. It was a vast, very expensive, very lavish, wonderful, in my view, pageant directed by the film director Danny Boyle that was a celebration of British culture and British creativity. Like all Olympic ceremonies, it was designed to try to say something about the nation to whom the Olympic torch had just been passed. Unlike most Olympic opening ceremonies, it was a resounding success. The history of Olympic opening ceremonies is a dark place of kitsch and cringeworthy moments, of things going wrong and of messages failing to get across. Danny Boyle created something remarkable. He succeeded where many others had failed in celebrating the national story of the country that was carrying the Olympic torch. He celebrated our history and our culture, and the ceremony famously celebrated some of our most loved national institutions, above all the NHS. And it revelled in Britain's creativity and its pop culture, and it celebrated our recent past, and it reminded the world of our unique place in youth culture and music and creativity. It also touched upon migration. Indeed, in celebrating the National Health Service, it could not help but touching upon migration, for from its inception, the National Health Service has been dependent upon migrants and remains so today. Among the moments for British history that were included in the Olympic opening ceremony that summer night in 2012 was the Industrial Revolution, the First World War, the struggle for women's suffrage that we're celebrating and marking again this year, and the Jarrow March. And one other event that surprised many people that was celebrated that night was the arrival in 1948 of the Empire Windrush. Indeed, a mock-up, miniature replica of that ship was created. It was built from a metal frame around which material had been stretched, and on that material was printed replicas of newspapers, newspaper covers, British newspapers of the 40s and 50s. That night on social media and the next morning in the newspapers, there were some voices who were very much in the minority, voices in the wings that condemned the opening ceremony as biased and left-wing. Its celebration, its lionization of the National Health Service, and the literally millions of people who'd worked in it since 1948 was seen by some as a political statement. The vision of Britain that was presented that night to the world, some people felt was in Britain they didn't recognize or feel affinity to. But as I said, those voices were very much in the minority. The mock-up Windrush that had been carried around the Olympic ceremony had funnels from which fake smoke bellowed. It was brought around the stadium by Black Londoners, a team of 21st century Black Londoners who were dressed in the baggy suits and the trilby hats and the flowery dresses of the 1940s, and they looked exactly like the men and women who can be seen in photographs from that age, arriving in Britain, cold, disorientated, shocked by the temperature, carrying battered leather suitcases and standing on the platforms of British railway stations. They looked exactly like their grandfathers and their grandmothers who'd arrived on the real Windrush 60 years earlier and on the many, many ships that came afterwards. At that moment in 2012, in an internationally televised moment, a pageant of national unity, an event millions watched and remembered, the arrival of the Windrush, the great symbolic event in the history of post-war migration and the black community, was set alongside other symbolic and great events in British history. The arrival of the migrants in 1948, the year the Windrush docked at Tilbury, was also the year the NHS was founded. It was ushered at that moment into the canon of British history. Not just black British history, but British history. Because I am culturally very British, although I'm half Nigerian, I had, like many people, presumed that the opening ceremony would be a disaster. I'd feared it would be a national embarrassment. Instead, I found myself, like many others I've spoken to, in tears. I've spoken to lots of black people for whom that moment of the Windrush being set alongside the Industrial Revolution, the First World War, the Jarrow March, to them it was a moment of inclusion, a moment when they felt a sense of acceptance and belonging that momentarily felt like it was going to wipe away memories of racism and rejection. Then as the ceremony went on, there was more. There was the sight of young Londoners of all races and mixed races performing routines about youth culture. And there was a greater sense of belonging, knowing that that generation will never know the racism of the Windrush generation. They'll never know signs that read no black, no Irish. They'll never know what the slogan KBW meant, Keep Britain White, a slogan that Winston Churchill contemplated using as an official party slogan for the 1950 general election, until he was talked out of it by colleagues. And that younger generation would not know the racism I experienced in the 1980s, a decade when black people did not and could not trust the police or believe that racial violence would be dealt with fairly or adequately. In the heart of the capital at that moment, the world was watching. Britain made a profound statement about its comfort and confidence that many people felt about migration and the place of the black community in our national story. 5 years later, Britain, to me, feels like a very different place. Attitudes to migration feel very different. There is a gulf between then and now. Things are so different that you have to ask yourself, how real was that moment in 2012? Did it really happen? And did the majority of people ever really think that way? Did we delude ourselves that we had become the nation that we told the world we were that evening in June 2012? There were two things about the opening ceremony that those of us who celebrated it in the press missed. Firstly, that being a celebration of Britain's creativity, it inevitably was a celebration of British youth. Inevitably, the performers, the young black Britons, were people from the demographic we know are far more comfortable than anybody else with globalism, integration, migration, and intermarriage. Secondly, and I think more importantly, the Olympic Games are awarded to cities, not nations. The 2012 Olympics were the London Olympics. They weren't the British Olympics. As a reflection of London and of the attitudes of young Londoners, the ceremony was probably accurate, probably fair, balanced, reasonable, caught that moment and who they were. What we've learned since is it did not capture the prevailing moods and the attitudes in the country, and it could not have spoken for the wider country. What the 2012 Games did not reflect is a view that increasingly looks like one that has captured the imaginations and the beliefs of a large proportion, still a minority, but a large proportion of this country. And it's a version of Britishness that also challenges British history. Because there's a version of Britishness that requires, for its sustenance, a version of the British past and British history. In that version of the British past, the Battle of Britain is a celebrated victory, but the Polish pilots who flew the Spitfires are forgotten. The planes are icons, symbols of that version of British history, but the wider understanding of the heterogeneity of the crews of bombers and fighters has been ushered to the margins. In that version of history, the Indian soldiers who fought in both world wars are forgotten. The fact that Britain might not have been able to hold her line in 1914 and the Western Front might not have been created because a French defeat might have been ushered in by the collapse of the British Army had it not been for the India Corps. That's, again, written out of the stories, as are the migrant communities who came to Britain and who added their DNA, both literal and cultural, into the nation. What's often been characterized, perhaps stereotyped, as an island story version of the British past is one that is resistant in multiple ways to stories of migration and one which I fear is on the march. And yet, if there's any nation on earth that can claim to have a culture and an identity that is pure, unadulterated, untouched by the outside world, unaffected by contact, migration, movement, and empire, that nation is not this one. One of the best ways of appreciating how global the nature of our culture is and how much of it is a result of migration, empire, and contact is to take our national drink, which statistics show is not quite yet cheap supermarket wine, but we're getting there. It is still reassuringly tea. As you know, tea comes from China. The British liked it so much, but they had nothing really to exchange it for that the Chinese wanted. Our main export was wool, which didn't normally impress the Chinese. So the British, I'm here skipping the Opium Wars for reasons of comfort. The British, other than becoming the greatest drug pushers the world had ever seen, I tried to resist it, sorry, began to grow the tea that they craved in India and Sri Lanka. By the end of the 19th century, there were 1 million people, over 1 million people in India and Sri Lanka growing tea for British consumption. Unlike the Chinese, the British developed the taste for sweetening tea with cane sugar. Sugarcane comes from New Guinea, but the British encountered it first in Brazil. They borrowed the Portuguese technology for the cultivation and the processing of cane sugar, which is one of the most difficult crops to grow and the most complex proto-industrial crops to process, and grew sugarcane on the islands of the Americas in the West Indies, famously, obviously, depressingly, with stolen African labor. We drink or drank this ultimate global drink in porcelain that we imported from China that we still call China. So what we had in the 17th and 18th centuries was an Asian crop grown on the islands of the Americas by Africans for consumption in Europe, where it was drunk in with Chinese crockery. It's worth saying that again. One of the effects of British history is that things that are remarkable sometimes get normalized. You have an Asian crop grown in the Americas by Africans for consumption in Europe. Historians have said that the only thing that's British in a cup of tea is the milk, but we imported our cows from Holland, so even that's questionable. Now, I'm not saying that what's great about the British cup of tea is that all of these things that don't come from Britain. I'm saying tea is quintessentially, classically British because it is a global product, a product of movement, migration, and empire. If I may, there's another example which I'm fond of. Back in the noughties, that decade we never found a proper name for, there was a constantly repeated recycled news story, and it centered on what was said to be our new national dish. It was reported that some poll or study that never really have existed had suggested that Britain's favourite dish by the noughties was chicken tikka masala. You will remember the story. The journalists who repeated and recycled this story loved to point out that it was a form of cultural cuisine fusion, because chicken tikka masala was a British-Indian hybrid dish. It originated in this country, in the curry houses of North England, not in the restaurants of Delhi or Calcutta, to which it was eventually exported. This, it was said, was an emblem of the nation that we had become, integrated and diverse and comfortable with that. The argument of many of these articles said that it was a triumph of Britishness, that chicken tikka masala was a symbol of our great shift in British culture and history, an indicator of the fact that we had gone from the post-war age of communities separated, finding their feet, to a more integrated Britain. That we'd accepted the migrants, that the migrants had integrated, and our cultures had fused. They had become part of mainstream culture. Many reports mentioned that chicken tikka masala had, they said, displaced from the top spot fish and chips. But the implication of those articles was that fish and chips was indigenous and in a way that chicken tikka masala was not. Yet what was forgotten to me, and what makes this a perfect example of a misunderstood view of our deeper history, is that fish and chips was just as global, just as much a product of integration, migration, and movement as chicken tikka masala. Potatoes, as you will know, are not indigenous to the British Isles. They're part of that great Columbian exchange. It means every day of our lives, virtually, we eat foods that originate in the New World. That most of us, in every day of our lives, we say unknowingly words from the Aztec language Nahuatl, words like potato, so words like tomato and potato and chocolate. And as for battered fish, it was brought to Britain by Portuguese Marranos Jews who arrived in the 16th century. The Portuguese brought the same innovation to Japan around the same time, where it was incorporated once again into another cuisine and became a seemingly indigenous dish, tempura. Another product, the equivalent, the Japanese equivalent of fish and chips, a product of migration, movement, empire, integration. Just as global as chicken tikka masala, but to an earlier, forgotten age of migration and movement and globalism. That we so forgotten that we convinced ourselves that it was invented here, that it was indigenously, organically British. There's a tendency among people like myself who think that migration is a good thing, that migration has helped us become the country that we are, that it's strengthened us. Historians like myself who believe that you can look around the world over the centuries, and very often the cultures that are the most dynamic, the wealthiest, the most forward-looking are those that have integration, that bring cultures together, those where migrants are welcomed. But there is a tendency to deny a reality that I think we need to acknowledge and accept, which is the scale of post-war migration was off the scale compared to earlier British migration. We do ourselves a disservice to not acknowledge that fact, and I believe we arm those who have a different view of migration. But those post-war phenomena, those post-war waves of migration, built on an older story, they were radically different in scale, but in nature they weren't. They're part of an older story. But I think there is a reason to acknowledge this and to be open about the fact that we've been through something unique in scale, because I think we're in a new age of hostility to migration and to the histories that underpin it. Historians who explore these aspects of British history are under attack, as are the histories that they uncover. The producers of popular culture, television programs, children's programs, when they include storylines that depict non-white people in parts of British history before 1945, find themselves subjected to waves of criticism and denouncements. This happened last year when the BBC produced a cartoon in which the father of a central family, set in Rome, ancient Rome, was a centurion who was depicted as dark-skinned. Now, this wasn't a new cartoon. It had just been picked up by people online using Twitter and other chat groups who had discovered it. It was already a year old when it was discovered. But when it was discovered, it became the focus of sustained online hostilities and attacks. The corporation was accused of having no respect anymore for historical accuracy. It was accused of being influenced by political correctness and distorting the past for reasons of political correctness. Now, you might have thought that this debate, these attacks, would come to an end when a professor of classics from this university, Professor Mary Beard, offered her judgment on the matter. You might have presumed that one of the world's foremost classicists, when she joined in the fray, that people would respect the facts that she put forward, and that would be an end of a rather silly debate. Instead, Professor Beard's involvement was the opening of a new phase in which racism, hostility to facts was fused with misogyny. At its most ridiculous, the American economist Nassim Nicholas Taleb said that Professor Mary Beard was talking, and I'm not going to say the second word. From this debate about the racial characteristics of fictional characters in a children's cartoon, Professor Taleb concluded that scholarship in the UK is dead. The online debates reiterated a central theme that is part of these discussions about migration and the role and the place of communities in Britain before 1945. The central theme is a recurring belief in conspiracy, the belief that historians and journalists and the makers of television programs are actively distorting the past for political reasons. The online culture warriors involved in this battle were not just hostile to their opponents, they were hostile to the facts that they marshalled. And they were often unwilling to distinguish fact from opinion. In the case of the BBC cartoon, the historical facts are this. We know that there were people who lived in Roman Britain who would fit the modern definition of black, but we also know that the Romans didn't recognize race as we see it today, and they didn't record it in their documents as a consequence. But the geography, as well as the archaeology and the history and the other sciences, inform us of these facts. It's not that surprising when you think about it. At its height, the Rome's empire stretched from the coast of North Africa, and sub-Saharan Africans passed through a southern border that was every bit as porous as the northern border, Hadrian's Wall. The archaeological evidence is clear, and it's been augmented by new forensic or relatively new forensic techniques such as isotope analysis. Both the archaeology and the history indicate that Africans from both above and below the Sahara made their homes in the British Isles. This research has given us figures like the Ivory Bangle lady, perhaps the most significant individual to have emerged from this sort of research, a 3rd century York citizen. Her remains were discovered in 1901, found in a stone sarcophagus, in which were a number of grave goods that were luxury items, blue glass beads, lockets made of silver and bronze, yellow glass earrings, and a beautiful blue glass perfume bottle. These objects all strongly suggested that this was the grave of a high social status resident of Roman York. Most significantly to me, she had 2 bracelets among her grave goods. One was made from ivory, from Africa, where I was born, where my ancestors came from. Though, of course, as we've just heard, that's true of everybody. If you go back far enough, saying your ancestors come from Africa doesn't mark you out very much as an individual or as a special case. But the other bracelet was made of jet stone, which came, we think, from Whitby on the northeast coast, where my English family came from. In 2009, 16 centuries after her death, the Ivory Bangle lady was subjected to radioisotope analysis, which I'm not going to pretend to understand. People with arts degrees should know their limits. This, combined with precise measurements of her skull and skeleton, and the chemical signatures left in her teeth by the food and drink she'd consumed as a child, came together to show that she was mixed race, but of North African descent. Her story and other research done suggests that parts of 3rd century York could have been as ethnically and racially diverse as the city is today in the 21st century. To many people who go to the wonderful museums in York, this is just a fascinating revelation. This is just something that's interesting. It's also one of those historical facts that's interesting and surprising, and then the more you think about it, becomes less surprising. The Roman Empire stretched across three continents, One of the things we associate most strongly with the Romans are roads, because they liked to travel. We know that there were citizens from the Roman provinces of Britain in other parts of the empire, so it's very unsurprising that the traffic was two-way. For most people, this is an interesting novelty. This is a new fact that people welcome, like we welcome learning new things about our country and our culture and the wider world. To some people, this evidence, the existence of the Ivory Bangle lady, has been seen as a threat. And none of this evidence, the science, the forensics, the professionalism of the people involved, historians, archaeologists, forensic experts, none of this can convince some people that what is taking place here is scholarship rather than conspiracy. And there is a backlash against attempts of people in all disciplines when their studies demonstrate the presence of non-white people in Britain before 1945 to be confronted by these sort of denouncements. Now, I think it's important to keep these trends in perspective. As I said, to most people, this is not a threatening history. And also, this is not entirely new. Historians of black history have known this for a long time. Back in the 1990s, the African-American historian Gretchen Gazina was told by an assistant in a London bookshop that there, quote, were no black people in England before 1945. She rather effectively disproved this by going on to write the classic book about black Georgians, of which we know an enormous amount, whose faces can be seen in the portraits in the National Portrait Gallery and in collections all over the country, whose diaries we have, who were published, who, as was said, one of whom studied in this university. This sort of weight of evidence is still something that some people are willing to question. The fundamental question, therefore, has to be, when so much evidence exists, when the weight of that evidence and the authority of the people who brought it to light is so unquestionable, why are some people threatened by this? Why are they offended by the idea of a black presence in Britain that stretches back beyond 1945? Why do they feel the need to dismiss science, history, and archaeology? Why are they at war with facts? I think it's important to ask this question because I would argue that the refusal to accept the black presence in Britain has a long and deep history is not just a symptom of racial thinking and racism. I think it is a form of racism. But I also think it's a rearguard attempt to defend an increasingly unsustainable, monochrome vision of British history. That vision in which black people arrived for the first time on the Windrush and not before. When I write about black British history before 1945, when I dig up details and explore lives, I'm accused, as I said, of doing it for political reasons. That presumption that people like myself use history as a political tool is based on an assertion that we feel the need to defend our presence in Britain by exaggerating the duration and the scope of the historical presence of black people. I can only speak for myself here and not for other scholars of black British history, but I'm astonished that people feel that our sense of belonging and identity and citizenship is that fragile that we would feel the need to distort history and fabricate evidence. And I think this presumption says an awful lot more about the people who make it than the people it's aimed at. I would argue that it reveals a view that immigrants who are non-whites can never be fully British. Now that's an idea that when I watched the Olympic ceremony in 2012, I think subconsciously I thought had run its time and its day was over. It was expressed probably most toxically in 1968 by Enoch Powell, who said a West Indian does not become, by being born in England, an Englishman. In law, he becomes a citizen of the United Kingdom. By birth, he is in fact still a West Indian or an Asian. What bothered Powell was that the generation of black Britons born in this country did see themselves as British, just as their fathers and their mothers who'd emigrated from the West Indies and from Africa saw themselves as citizens of the British Empire. The idea that Britishness is a racial identity, or perhaps more accurately, Englishness is a racial identity, is a position, it feels to me, that is now more openly and regularly expressed than any time since the 1980s, when it was shouted by skinheads on the streets of Britain to black people and their allies. The history that counters that view, that shows black Britons as part of this country for centuries, is therefore itself contested. Historical evidence is being dismissed, research is being confronted with opinion and alternative facts. Two conflicting, contradictory views of British history and British identity, and the role of migration in forging them, are beginning to emerge. 2012 feels like a long, long time ago. To me, the most clearly voiced expression of this form of British history that denies migration, that marginalises empire and its significance, was given in another speech by Enoch Powell, this time not so well known. A speech that was given on St. George's Day in 1961. In that speech, Powell explained to his audience that he believed that there was a deep providential difference, and here I'm quoting, between our empire and those of others. What had made the British Empire, Powell said, so unique was, and here I quote again, that the nationhood of the mother country remained unaltered through it all, almost unconscious of the strange, fantastic structure built around her. Britain was, Powell said, in modern parlance, uninvolved. In the same speech, he went on to say, the continuity of her existence was unbroken, and when looser connections which had linked her to distant continents and strange races fell away, it is our generation which comes home from years of distant wandering. We discover affinities with earlier generations of English who felt no country but this to be their own. We discover affinities with them. And he went on to say, in what has to be said is beautiful, elegiac prose, no matter what you might think of Enoch Powell. I think I've expressed what I think of Enoch Powell. He wrote, backwards travels our gaze, beyond the grenadiers and the philosophers of the 18th century, beyond the pikemen and the preachers of the 17th, back through the brash, adventurous days of the First Elizabeth and the hard materialism of the Tudors. And there, at last, we find them, or seem to find them, in many a village church beneath the tall tracery of a perpendicular east window and the coffering ceiling of a chantry chapel. From brass and stone, from line and effigy, their eyes look out at us, and we gaze into them, as if we would win some answer from their silence. Tell us what binds us together. Show us the clue that leads through 1,000 years. Whisper to us the secrets of this charmed life of England. As Powell was making that speech, Queen Elizabeth was on her way to Sierra Leone for the ceremony that would mark the independence of Britain's oldest colony in Africa. Also, as he was making that speech, we were approaching the high water mark of migration from the West Indies. The problem was that the strange races hadn't fallen away. The strange races that Britain had been in contact with were people who had been partners and victims of 5 centuries of imperialism. Many of them had become British citizens. More of them aspired to become British citizens. Some of them at that moment were on their way with British Empire passports to these shores. The very aspects of British history, empire, migration, cultural fusion, intermarriage, that Powell wanted to escape from and disavow were the aspects that explains why Britain looks the way it does today and why the great transformations that were happening in the post-war period were taking place. They're the stories that explain why people like myself, half English, half Nigerian, came to be in this country. How the Church of England arrived in Lagos, the home of my father, an African city with a Portuguese name, as much a place of fusion as any others. But whatever the exclusions and omissions of that version of the past that Powell offered us, irrespective of its blind spots, I believe it's fundamentally a fantasy. No matter what it says or doesn't say about immigration, migration, empire. The idea that we can commune with ancestors so distant, and in doing so, find ourselves again, discover an inner essence of Englishness, is a profound delusion, and I believe a dangerous one. We are the peoples and the nation that was made by empire and migration, the people who eat fish and chips, chicken tikka masala, and drink tea in Chinese cups. 500 years of imperial history, 5 centuries of being a global power. There is no isolated, uninvolved, unadulterated England to which to return, even if we wanted to. Our nation and who we are simply doesn't make sense unless we do better at understanding the stories of migration and imperial history that was the engine of that movement. Nobody said it better than the great academic and intellectual Stuart Hall, who once said, "We are here because you were there." Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for giving us an insight into various aspects of migration and how migration is being seen and understood in some parts and parcels of British society today. We're in an age of soundbite and obviously alternative facts and conflicting political views, all coupled and enhanced in some way with social media. So it's really important that there is appreciation and real understanding of the waves of migration that are part of this country's history. But so how to convey balanced information about migration and about our identities and how they've changed and evolved through time is obviously a major challenge in, our country and our societies today. And obviously, you and people in your position have opportunities to try to help with discourse, with books, with TV. But perhaps in some way we all have to try to make a difference because it's so important in this country at this time. Well, of course, there are problems like this in many countries around the world. It's sort of a wave going around. So looking now, though, towards next week, I guess we're going to focus more closely on several aspects, because next week's lecturer is Professor Chandran Kokathas from the London School of Economics, and he's going to consider the impact of attempts to protect liberal democratic values. He's going to be speaking on immigration and freedom. So we hope to see you all then. But before we go tonight, let's just thank David again very much indeed